Firstly, obviously, they are focused on character rather than on action. And think about this. With the other two approaches we've looked at, it's really all about what you should do. But the virtue theorist says that's the wrong place to start. You can't start with what to do. You've actually got to start with who should you be, and only that will enable you to do the right thing. So I don't usually try to separate the idea of morality and ethics, but if you were to do that, one way to draw that line is to say that morality is what it's good to be, whereas ethics is what it's good to do. And the virtue theorist says you've got to start with morality because that's going to drive you into doing the right thing, ethically speaking. The other thing to know about virtue is that it's all about excellence of character. So I'm sure you can think of good examples of virtues. Things that'll pop into your head as I say that. I know it's a bit of an old-fashioned term, but we know what we mean when we talk about virtue. We're talking about things like courage. We're thinking about things like integrity, compassion, honor, things like that. Those are the kinds of character traits we're talking about. And the idea is that, from the virtue theorists, is that we should seek to develop those traits to a degree of excellence. And it's important to recognize here that virtue is not binary. We tend to be binary in our society. We tend to think it's this or that. But actually, virtue theory doesn't work quite the same way. So if I said to you, as an example of a virtue, I said courage, and I asked you what you thought the vice associated with that would be, you would say cowardice, which makes a lot of sense. And we're naturally binary. We think it's courage or cowardice. But actually, the virtue theorist says the virtue is a kind of sweet spot. It's what Aristotle called the golden mean. It's just the right amount of this particular characteristic. And you can have too much or too little. So with courage, again, we have the virtue is courage. If you have too little of that characteristic, you are a coward. But if you have too much of it, that's also a vice. There we would say something like you're rash. And that would be the vice in that particular case. And I'll give you an example. It's a controversial example, and I'm certainly not taking any sides on this, but to illustrate this point. So in the Falklands War, the commanding officer of the paratroop regiment engaged in that war was a Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones. And H. Jones was killed in the war and awarded a Victoria Cross for his actions posthumously for the action that led to his death. And the situation was this, and I've had the privilege of being in the Falklands and seeing the spot where H. Jones fell. And essentially it's at the bottom of a low but quite steep set of small hills. And the paras were pinned down at the bottom of these hills, and at the top were Argentinian forces, including dug-in machine gun positions. You can actually still see the trenches where they were dug in. And so they were pinned down. It was a tough situation. And at one point, H. Jones decides he's got to break this stalemate. So he grabs a Sterling submachine gun from one of his guys, and he starts running up the hill, firing at this machine gun, and gets cut down. He gets killed for this action. As I said, he's awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest recognition that we have for courage. But there are some at the time, some still today, who thought that actually that wasn't a courageous act, that he'd gone too far in that characteristic. It was arguably a rash act. He shouldn't have done that. So again, a controversial case. I'm not trying to take a position on it, but it's an example of how the idea of virtue works. Also important in virtue ethics is the role of moral exemplars. So some of you might be old enough to remember there was a trend some years back for bracelets and things like that had these initials on. They had the letters WWJD with a question mark. And that, of course, stood for what would Jesus do? And the idea was that if you were a Christian, you would wear something like this, which would remind you that at any particular moment when you're facing an ethical decision, you should ask yourself, what would Jesus do in this situation? Now, obviously, if you're not a Christian, you're not going to choose that moral exemplar. But the idea is the same. that at any particular moment you're facing a difficult decision, you ask yourself, what would that person who is my example of a virtuous person, what would they do in this situation? And I will try to emulate that. And really this ties into the idea of leadership by example. If you are a leader, what is it that you really want from your team, from the people in your team? You want them to go, what would the boss do in this situation? And do it. And that's the idea of being a moral exemplar, which is really foundational and vital for virtue ethics. Another key point about virtue ethics is this idea that it must be developed through practice. And so none of us are born with virtue. We have different character traits, but things like courage and compassion and integrity are things that must be developed over time. And so we need to build it up, and you never become fully virtuous. So the Stoics used to say that the fully virtuous person is as rare as the phoenix. So we're always on a trajectory. We're always increasing our virtue through practice, through what we do. And I'll give you an example. At my job at the US Naval Academy, I had a colleague who was a retired Navy captain, and he did a very interesting little experiment. So the first thing he did was he typed up a list of the virtues that he thought were the most important virtues for him, and he rated himself on those virtues. How am I doing on all of these things? But then he also printed 5 more copies of that sheet out and gave each one to somebody who knew him very well and asked them to rate him according to those virtues. And as he tells the story, he was a bit surprised by what came back. He had clearly some character weaknesses that he hadn't recognized, that his friends and family who knew him well had identified for him, which was a bit humbling, but then humility is also a virtue, so that's good. And what he did from there was he summarized the virtues that from this exercise he realized he needed to practice most, and he put a list of them in his wallet, and every morning he would look in his wallet and look at these virtues and remind himself, I'm going to be more, whatever that virtue was, whether it was compassionate, courageous. I'm not saying I don't know what the list was, but whatever it was, he made a deliberate decision to practice virtue, and that's a very fundamental idea in virtue theory. So what are the pros and cons of this approach to ethics? Again, it's very appealing in military circles, particularly if you take one version of it, which is Stoicism. There are some very clear strong points. Firstly, obviously, it seems to make sense to take character seriously as part of ethics. Ethics is not just about what you do in that particular situation. We don't wait until we get to some challenging situation and pull our ethics out of our pockets and go, okay, now I figure out what to do. It makes sense to us that character matters, that's part of this, and virtue theory does that well. It also addresses the broader issue of the worthwhile life. It's not the quandary ethics. Again, it's not just pulling out your ethics in the moment when you need it. It's about who you become, what kind of person you are, and that's vital. And this emphasis on practicing ethical behavior also makes sense to us. We've seen that in practice. You know people who deliberately decide to become better people by working on it. They recognize their flaws and they work on it. And again, that seems right. That seems important in us making good ethical decisions. And obviously, this idea of role modeling, I don't need to elaborate that because that's such a big thing in military circles. Again, we think that that's vital. So there are lots of pros to virtue ethics, but there are also some key cons. One problem here is that if you were to look at lists of virtues over time in our society, you go back 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 years, and you line them up next to each other, you would see that you had quite different answers to what virtue looks like. Not just in terms of the actual virtues that are listed, but also in terms of the ordering of them, in terms of order of importance. So there is no fixed point for virtues. It's very much captured in our culture as that culture stands now. And so that's a problem. There's a kind of subjectivity to it. Just as consequentialism has no fixed point, and which is dangerous because it can mean that the greatest utility can lead to some outcome that we actually think is wrong, The problem with virtue is that there's no fixed point, and so the lists of virtues might look very different. And so you could end up you could find yourself growing up in a situation where some virtues were held up as the key things, but then you move context, and actually those are not the things that should matter. And that's only in our society. Imagine when we take this to other societies and we think, well, what are the virtues here? Different cultures have very different sets of virtues. We talk about, for example, honor cultures, where one's personal honor is the most important thing. And so, it would be considered acceptable to lie in order to protect your honor. Whereas we might think differently. We might think that telling the truth is more important than your personal honor. So there isn't a fixed point, and that's a drawdown, a negative, if you like, of virtue ethics. But perhaps the strongest con, or the biggest weak point of virtue ethics, is that it doesn't give one explicit guidance on what to do in difficult situations. So its great strength, of course, is that it doesn't focus on the what to do, but that's also its great weakness. It doesn't tell you what you should do in any specific situation. And let's illustrate that with our scenario once again. In this case, the transplant surgeon is, let's say, Dr. Aristotle. And so he's trying to decide what he should do. Well, he knows the answer is he should do the virtuous thing. And so, yes, okay, Aristotle, do the virtuous thing, but what is the virtuous thing? Well, I should do what a virtuous person would do in my situation. Right? Well, what would a virtuous person do in my situation? Well, they would display the virtues. Okay, what are the virtues? Well, their integrity, their courage, their honesty, and we could keep listing them. But it doesn't tell you what you should do. It doesn't tell you in that situation what the right thing to do is. Let me give you another example to illustrate how challenging it is to use a virtue to give you the right answer. Let's imagine you are in a situation where it's a small unit engagement. You are the unit sniper, and you're engaged the enemy. There is incoming mortar fire, and it's an insurgent situation. That mortar fire, you realize, is being directed by a 10-year-old girl on a cell phone. She's calling in the fire, and it's getting increasingly dangerous, and it's looking likely that it might cause some casualties on your side. You're looking at her through the scope, and let's say in this situation, it's entirely up to you to make the choice of whether to shoot her or not. So let's take one example of a virtue. Let's take moral courage. What is the morally courageous thing to do in this situation? Well, let's consider the option of shooting the girl. Is it morally courageous to shoot a 10-year-old girl? Well, in some sense, yes. I know that seems odd, but it would be a very difficult thing for us to do. If it's a necessary thing, it would go against the grain in all sorts of ways. I hope that's true of you. The idea of killing a child just really strongly goes against the grain, and so it would take a lot of moral courage to pull the trigger. But would it take moral courage to not pull the trigger and accept the risk onto yourself and your team? Well, of course, that would also take moral courage. And so moral courage is a virtue. It seems very relevant here, but it doesn't tell you what you should do. And so that's an example of the challenge of leaning entirely on virtue theory as your ethical approach. So these are the three main ways of thinking about ethics that we face in our world today. If you go through society, people will give you answers that draw on one or other of these. That's the natural thing that will happen. And so what should we do? If we had to decide for SOCOM, if we had to decide for Army, which approach we were going to choose, which one would you choose? Well, you might have an intuition on this, but I think the answer is perhaps we shouldn't choose. I think the answer is we should triangulate. We should draw on all three of these approaches as we make decisions. And I think that there are two key reasons for this. Firstly, as we've seen, each of these approaches has pros and cons. They have strengths and weaknesses. And the strength of one is often in the same position as the weakness of the other. So think about deontological ethics, constraints. Well, the strength of that is that it's very good at giving you clear and fixed rules about what you should do. And so there's that idea of tying yourself to the mast. It's a very fixed point. But the problem, one of the weaknesses, key weaknesses, is that it can be inflexible. Whereas with consequentialism, well, its great strength is its flexibility. You can take that approach to ethics into any situation, any culture, and ask yourself, what is going to result in the greatest utility for the greatest number? It's very portable, it's very flexible. But its problem is it lacks fixed points. We're worried about what happens with justice because there are no fixed points that stop you going to certain places. So again, you've got your strength and your weakness kind of balancing each other. Think about virtue theory. The great strength of virtue theory is that it focuses on character and brings that to the fore, but it's weak on action. The other two approaches are strong on action, but weak on character. And so if we align them up right, we can avoid the pitfalls of all three. So I think one of the reasons for triangulating is that we'll make better decisions. But the other thing, as I've tried to mention along the way, is that all three of these approaches are really fundamental. They are, in a way, the ethical peak of fundamental ideas that define the nature of our society. And so as military professionals, there's a sense in which, yes, your personal ethics matters, but actually you are making ethical decisions as an agent of the state. And so it's appropriate for your ethical decisions to reflect all three of these strands that are so fundamental in the nature of our society. So there's the question then of how to apply them. And I think the order matters. In fact, I think it really matters. And I think I'm going to push onto you, I'm going to encourage you to start always with the constraints. Always start with the rules, whether they be limitations or permissions. Why? Why do we want to start there? Well, I think two main reasons. Firstly, remember that these are the distilled wisdom of the ages. There's good reason we have these rules, and most of the time they're going to give you the right answer. If you run out of time, you can only think about the rules, you're probably going to get the right answer. So the distilled wisdom of the ages, we start there for that reason. The other is the alternative, which is our natural approach, is to go to the consequences first. The problem there is that, as we've seen, we're not actually that great at calculating consequences. So we don't want to do that first. We want to start with the rules. That gives us our fixed point, and then consider the consequences from there. So my constraints tell me this, I should do this, but we shouldn't stop there. We want to ask whether the consequences outweigh those constraints, as they sometimes do. Not very often, but sometimes they do. So the rule says, when you're driving, you should stick to the speed limit, or at least more or less close enough. But if the consequence of that is that the person in the back seat of the car will bleed to death before you get to the hospital, then of course the consequence outweighs the constraint. So there are situations where the consequences outweigh the constraints. But remember that we think that consequences are where we're bad at calculating them. So we only want to do that when those consequences are very significant and very clear, that we're very sure they're going to happen and they're very significant. They've got to be really important consequences to outweigh the rules, because those rules are the distilled wisdom of the ages. So start with the constraints, then go to the consequences. But the third step is to step back and go, let me just review this decision by looking at myself. Is my character skewing my perspective? What do I know about my character? Maybe I've done an exercise like my former Naval Academy colleague did, and I've worked out what my weak points are. Yeah, my strengths are good, but I worked out my character weaknesses, and I know that I'm prone to whatever it is. Is that influencing my calculation here? Is it skewing my thinking in the decision that I'm almost about to make? And that will stop me from falling into problems by doing that character check. But there is another aspect to this, because remember what Aristotle said. Aristotle said, we are what we do. In other words, we become virtuous or vicious by the decisions we make, by the actions we take. Every time you do something, every time you make a choice, you are shaping your character. And that can be for good or for ill. And so if you ask yourself, okay, I think I know where I'm going with this, I think I'm going to do this, but what will doing that do to my character? Who am I becoming as I make that choice? And that's going to be a very powerful thing for you and potentially protect you from moral injury, which we'll talk about a little bit later on.